When questions come up in threes, I take it as a sign to make a video. So recently, over the last, I would say, few days, I've had the same sort of conversation with a few different people. And it's something like this. When it comes to experiencing non-dual or boundless experience, or experience without boundaries, without a sense of a subject being me or this body or something here, or awareness, opposed to or experiencing an object out there, which can be a physical object or an apparent physical object. It can be a color, a sound, it can also be an emotion, and it can also be a thought. So the subject-object experience is part of this apparatus that makes things appear to be divided, separate, solid, etc. So the question or comment was, in certain environments, that's much easier. So when I'm in nature, for instance, I'm walking through the forest, it's much easier to experience the sense of not being a distinct self apart from the scenery. There's just scenery, just walking, just leaves rustling, just light moving through branches. And yet when I go home, it feels very difficult to do this. Objects feel at a distance. Things feel discrete, separate, and solid. So the first thing I'll say about this is it's pretty common that when we first start tasting non-duality experientially, which typically falls somewhere on a spectrum, it can be just a subtle sense of melting into the environment or the environment melting into you, or it can be a very discrete and obvious sense of being in two places at once, where you look down at the ground and at the same time you are the ground and you are whatever the looking is. So you feel like you're sort of in both places at the same time, or you experience yourself as another object or person. Now this second case, understand there's no way to think about this. If you imagine it, try to understand it, try to figure it out scientifically, that's not what I'm talking about. It just will confuse you. But when it happens, when you actually know it as fundamentally true and obvious, it's unmistakable and it's sort of unforgettable as well. Now that can happen for a brief moment, or it can happen ongoing. So why are these experiences, especially early on in the process of realization or disentangling identity from thought, concept, perceptual filters? Well, the simple explanation is when you're in an environment you're familiar with, you've seen it many times, you have emotional attachment to it. Even if it seems inanimate, there's emotional attachment to the sense of the place that makes you feel secure, safe, and the place that you call home. There's a lot of autobiographical information in memory. And so because this feels like our home, our space, we tend to objectify it. We tend to see it as a construct that's more solid. We tend to see it as a construct at all. And with this comes the sense of subjectification, or moving backward in experience, feeling like a subject, experiencing a world out there which is full of objects, or even the inner world full of objects, thoughts, memories, etc. So there are a couple suggestions I've made on how to navigate this or what to do in this case. But first I want to say a couple things about it. One is it's totally normal. It makes sense that in some environments the conditions are just more favorable to sort of merge, or to feel the underlying truth that things are not separate, things are not divided. So it's normal. The second thing I want to say about it is you can have these experiences or tastes before awakening. But if you're trying to solidify this, if you're trying to make this into a continuous experience, and you've never had a significant shift in identity, never had what I describe as awakening in multiple playlists, I would usually urge somebody to work on that, work on what we call self-inquiry, or investigating the nature of the sense of self. Now, obviously, I'm not going to go into great detail on that here, but I do want to sort of point out that we can believe there's no self. We can believe that there's no where for inquiry to land. And we can do a little bit of inquiry and look around and see that, oh, I don't find a self, and conclude there isn't one. And yet the sense of you can be completely intact, and usually is completely intact. The feeling of being you, The sense that you're something navigating the world apart from everything, apart from objects, that you have some discrete existence. That's what you're investigating. That's the point of self-inquiry, or one-pointed approach, or investigating the nature of thought and consciousness in a very direct way, in a continuous way. The point of all of those exercises are to realize or recognize the unity of consciousness, which is just a step in this whole process, but it's a big step when you take it. What that means is we realize that any thought we could ever have, any thought about the way things are, about the way we are, any thought about how we're doing, what's important, what's not important, any thought about the spiritual process, any memory, all of it is just structured in consciousness. It's just a way consciousness is presenting itself in the moment. And it doesn't define us at all. It doesn't define the truth of who or what we are at all. So once you see that, the only place to look is in the whole of consciousness, or the whole of the pure sense of I, which encompasses everything you've ever thought. That's an important recognition, an important shift along the path. So before that happens, it can be very frustrating to try to force the non-dual experience, or try to force yourself to see that, well, essentially, you don't exist apart from the entire environment. It's going to be very difficult. Even after awakening, it tends to take a good amount of work, focus, surrender. So usually I prioritize the initial shift, awakening Kensho, and I have a couple playlists describing that. So beyond that, I do want to address a couple of strategies or a couple of orientations that may be helpful when you start to notice that in certain environments, it's much easier to recognize the naturally seamless, boundless, merged knowing of the environment functioning as one seamless whole. And then in other times and situations, it's much more challenging. So what to do? Well, one thing you can do is spend more time in those environments where the natural non-dual experience at whatever level it's appearing is more readily clear, readily available. Another thing you can do is when you're moving from one environment to another, let's say you're at home and you decide to go take a walk in the park, become very present when you're at home, when you've decided to get up and go take a walk, or go to a park, or go spend time in nature. What are the sounds like without describing them to yourself, just experiencing? What is the visual field like? What are the forms like? What is movement like? Just attune to that. Put your attention there. See if there are any markers that suggest, oh, this is at a distance. Where's that information coming from? So essentially, you're sort of beginning a gentle, curious inquiry. And then try to keep that inquiry going, that presence, that absorption inquiry, going as you get up, put on your shoes, put on your jacket, open the door, take a step through the door, take a step onto the porch, and then begin walking toward the park or your car or wherever you're going to spend time in nature. But stay in that presence. Notice the seamlessness of it. Notice how one color flows into another color. The sensation of one footstep on the ground is suddenly replaced with or merged with the great blue sky. Keep your attention there. Keep noticing as you transition, as you move. And see if you can find where or when the experience starts changing from a dualistic experience to a seamless experience or a non-dualistic experience. Is it right when you enter the forest or the park? Is it when you've been there a little while? Is it when you're on your way? Is it when you leave your house? Look and see. See when it starts to change and how it starts to change. You can also do this in simple ways around your house. Does it feel the same indoors as outdoors, in your yard versus in your kitchen, bedroom, bathroom? Do this through staying present and you might notice some shifts. Another suggestion is to look at a familiar object, something that definitely feels at a distance for you. And then ask yourself, if I were seeing this or experiencing this in the forest, Just that one object. Could be a chair, could be a lamp, could be the wall. Just imagine you're in a completely different environment, an unfamiliar environment, and there it is. You're just looking right at it. Does it have the same meaning? Does it have the same distance? Does it have the same solidity? So what is it about the environment that changes, if anything? Is it something in the object that feels distant? Is it something about the environment or context? Is it something about you? Look around in your experience and see. Try to feel it out. And a third approach, a much more subtle approach. This is getting at a sort of deeper identity structure. This is more helpful when someone's starting to experience non-dual, but it's not continuous. Or you'll experience it one day and the next day it seems to be gone and then it comes back. So when you experience that kind of fluctuating, notice this. Notice there's something very subtle in the background. Not in the background out there, in the background of what feels like you. Something that's sort of hiding within the view from which you're looking at the world. And it's there, and it's monitoring. It's monitoring the situation, like, how is it right now? How am I right now? How do I feel? What's here and what's not here? And it'll relate it to things that are important to you. So if spirituality is important to you, it'll relate it to that. How clear do I feel today? How non-dual do things look today? Now understand this is usually precognitive or not something you're verbally stating to yourself internally. It's built into the view. Other thoughts may be structured with the assumption of this belief that things are a certain way for me right now. I'm experiencing the world like this, and yesterday I was experiencing it like that. Almost like judging the momentary experience. Now at this level, it's often not a judgment like I like it or I don't. There may be no pushing or pulling on anything. There may be equanimity, and yet something is still monitoring. The purpose of this is different than the purpose of the reaction body. It's not trying to react to the environment. It's really just trying to stay continuous or solid. It's trying to keep the sense of you continuous and solid from moment to moment or from environment to environment. So it does this by referring to itself here as the one experiencing or monitoring the situation. Oh, I feel good. And then referencing back to itself later in another environment or another situation. So you could say one thought reflecting another thought, one belief or moment of noticing reflecting another moment of noticing. And that sort of comparison or seeming transition can make it appear as if there's something moving from moment to moment, as if there's a you moving from moment to moment or moving through experience. So look into this, see if it's actually there. If so, what is it? What is its nature? Can you precisely locate it? This kind of work can be really powerful for seeing that there aren't different environments in the way our mind thinks about it. There's only this environment. It's endlessly changing. It's without any actual essence. It's not in time or space. But I got to use some word, so I'm going to call it an environment, a non-dual environment. But there's no one that's moving from this environment to a different type of environment called the future. And there's not someone or some entity, some being or some consciousness that moved into this moment from a previous moment. That's just a reflection in thought. It's imagined. And the monitoring, this sense of trying to take a position. How am I doing? How's this practice going? How is the environment looking? And then trying to compare it to how it appears at a different time. This is the illusion. See through that, and then time itself will collapse. And without the sense of time, the illusion of space will collapse not far behind.